Welcome to the Hollow Files, where the forgotten, the cursed, and the unspeakable are brought back into the light. Tonight, we open another case from the shadows. The Valley of Glenori resists discovery. Even on the rare mornings when the Highland sun pushes through the clouds, the mist clings to the slopes like a secret it refuses to share. Past the last winding track, where the heather sways in cold winds and the fences crumble into the soil, a ring of standing stones rises from the ground. They're jagged, weather-beaten, but standing with such precise intent that no one believes they're the work of chance. No one can say when they were placed there. They've outlasted the parish church, the market road, and the memory of the families who first settled here. But the locals will tell you this: the stones watch. One autumn morning in 1862, a shepherd named Ian McCrae vanished into that glen. His flock was found quietly grazing near the ridge. His shepherd's crook lay on the grass, inches from the largest stone. There was no sign of a struggle, only a strange stillness in the air, the kind that presses against your skin, warning you that you're not alone. The village elders had a name for what they believed took him: Anskyle, the old shadow. No shape, no face. It moved only when watched. Once it found you, it would never lose you. Outsiders dismissed it as Highland superstition, but in Glenori, the rule was clear: no one walked past the stones after dark. 2 days after McCrae's disappearance, the minister's son found something carved in the back of the largest stone. A perfect spiral, freshly etched, its lines sharp as though cut by a blade that had never dulled. It wasn't there before. When the constable from the town of Or came to investigate, he studied it for a moment, his face paling. He then mounted his horse and left without a single question, and never returned. Years passed. The glen grew emptier, quieter, until the only sounds were the wind through the heather and the faint rustle of something moving in the grass where no footsteps were seen. And here is where our journey begins. In the shadow of stones older than history, in a place where silence is not peace, but a warning. The old kirk of Glenori stands on a small rise, its roof half collapsed, the bell tower leaning like a weary sentinel. The windows are nothing but jagged mouths of glass, and when the wind moves through them, it sounds almost like voices. Locals say the kirk was abandoned long before it began to crumble, not because the congregation dwindled, but because the sermons themselves began to change. The last minister, Reverend Alistair Munro, had served the parish for 30 years, known for his stern discipline and unshakable faith. He had never once mentioned the stones in his preaching until the summer of 1861. One Sunday, he paused mid-sermon, staring out through the open doorway toward the hills. The silence stretched so long, the congregation began shifting in their seats. Then he said only one sentence, his voice low and cold: "They have opened the ground." No one knew what he meant. When questioned afterward, he refused to speak of it, even to his wife. But within weeks, whispers began to circulate. Villagers claimed they had seen Reverend Munro walking the ridge at night, his lantern swinging in the mist, heading straight toward the glen. By autumn, his sermons had grown strange. Instead of scripture, he spoke of patterns in the earth, of voices that carried through stone, and of a watcher that moved unseen between the kirk and the standing circle. Those who attended described an unease that settled over the pews like a heavy fog, making their skin prickle. In November, during the evening service, a sudden gust blew the doors wide open. Every candle guttered out, and the kirk was plunged into darkness. When the light was restored, the reverend was gone. His Bible lay open on the pulpit, but the pages were blank. For days, search parties scoured the hills. All they found was his lantern, lying cold beside the same stone where McCrae's shepherd's crook had been discovered. The villagers stopped looking. Some swore they could still hear his voice carried on the wind when they passed the kirk, reciting verses no one recognized. After that night, the parish sealed the kirk's doors. No service has been held there since. But travelers still pause when they pass the ruin, shivering at the sound of the wind through the broken windows, for it always seems to form words, though none are clear enough to understand. And if you stand in the kirk's doorway at dusk, facing the glen, you might notice something strange. The stones on the ridge no longer seem quite as far away as they were before. Long before Reverend Monroe's sermons turned strange, before Ian McCrae vanished among the stones, there was another story, one so old that even the parish records treat it more as folklore than fact. But the handwriting is there, in faded ink on the kirk's surviving registry, dated October 1746. That year, the Highlands were still reeling from the Jacobite defeat at Culloden. British soldiers patrolled the roads, and many families abandoned their homes, hiding in the glens to avoid retribution. Glenori was quiet, its remoteness offering a fragile kind of safety. But safety can be an illusion. Her name was Elsie Cameron, a weaver's daughter of 17. She had been seen in the market in Invery only 2 days before, cheerful, carrying a bundle of wool, and was expected home before nightfall, but she never returned. The next morning, her father found her market basket sitting at the edge of the ridge near the circle of stones. Inside was the wool, neatly folded, and a sprig of rowan berries placed carefully on top. The rowan tree was considered a powerful charm against evil in Scottish tradition, but placing the berries there was not protection, it was an invitation. Witness accounts in the registry describe the search that followed. Villagers combed every slope, every gully, calling her name. They found no footprints, no torn fabric, nothing disturbed in the grass, just a heavy, unnatural silence. 3 days later, her younger brother swore he saw
her standing at the far edge of the glen. He ran toward her, calling out, but she did not move. As he drew closer, the mist rose between them. When it cleared, she was gone. Only the rowan berries remained, scattered at his feet. The official cause was listed as "lost to the glen," a phrase that appears 6 more times in the records over the next century. No explanation, no details, just those words. The old folk in the village still mutter about Elsie Cameron. They say she wasn't taken by force, she was led, drawn by something she could not see but could hear. Some claim the weaver's loom was found still threaded in her home, but the pattern she had begun was unlike any seen before. A spiral repeating endlessly, tighter and tighter toward the center. And so the story faded into the fabric of the glen's history, buried under more recent losses. But the registry remains, and on the page listing her name, the ink has not faded like the rest. It is as black as the day it was written, as though someone or something wants it to be remembered. The spiral carved into the largest stone after Ian McCrae's disappearance was not unique. In fact, it had been seen before, not only in Glenori, but in ancient sites scattered across Scotland, etched into stones older than the Picts themselves. In 1893, an antiquarian named Malcolm Ferguson visited Glenori to document the standing circle. His sketches still survive in the archives at Edinburgh, showing the spiral in remarkable detail. Ferguson noted something curious. The design was mathematically perfect, its curve consistent and precise, as though cut by an artisan with tools far beyond the crude chisels of prehistoric builders. But Ferguson's real discovery came not from the stones in the glen, but from a crumbling manuscript he purchased from an estate sale in Perth. It was a fragment of a medieval monk's journal, written in Latin, describing a pattern of the eye, a spiral believed to be a door between worlds. The monk claimed it was not a Christian symbol, but something far older, left by those who walked before the first men. The journal warned that the spiral was not merely decorative. When inscribed on stone and placed in a certain alignment with the moon and hills, it could call the shadow. The monk wrote that once the shadow came, it would follow the thread of its own mark until it found what it sought. Those marked by the spiral, either on their skin, in their homes, or in their path, could never truly escape it. The villagers had their own version of the story. They claimed the spiral was a pathway, a way to lead something into the world, but also to lead it back. But the path worked in both directions. If the spiral was unfinished, the thing it called could not leave. It would remain, waiting, bound to the place and to those who entered it. The stone with the spiral still stands in Glenori, though the lines have weathered faint under wind and rain. Yet on certain nights, when the mist is low and the air tastes of iron, locals swear the carving feels fresh under the fingertips, sharp, cold, and wet, as if cut only moments before.
Before Glenori had parish records, before the kirk was even a dream in the minds of masons, stories lived in the voices of the people. Around peat fires, shepherds and crofters told Nansandoween, the songs of the old ones. These were not gentle ballads, but warnings disguised as lullabies. One of the oldest spoke of Unlubid Moor, the great Coil. It told of a hunter who followed a wounded stag into the mist and found himself in a circle of stones he had never seen before. On the largest stone was a spiral, its grooves filled with water that reflected the moon. The hunter drank from the spiral's pool and found that the moon's reflection was not the same as the moon above. In the reflection, the hills were higher, the stars sharper, and shapes moved in the darkness between the stones. The song ends with the hunter returning home, but never speaking again. His children claimed he sometimes rose at night and stood outside in the frost, tracing spirals in the air with his finger. Another tale, told in hushed tones by elders, was of the Bansella, the woman of the second sight. She warned her neighbors that the spiral was not made by men, but by those who dig through the dark where light cannot follow. She said that when the wind carried the right note, like the low moan through a kirk's broken window, it meant the ground had shifted and the path in the spiral was opening. These tales were not written, only spoken, passed through generations like embers kept alive in the hearth. But fragments have been preserved in a curious way. In the late 1700s, a schoolmaster in Glenori, tasked with improving literacy, had his students write down verses from their grandparents' songs. Among the faded exercise books, now kept in the Argyll archives, the spiral appears again and again, drawn in clumsy charcoal lines beside warnings in uneven handwriting. Do not walk the stones after sundown. Do not step inside the spiral shadow. Do not drink from the moon's reflection. The strangest detail? None of the children wrote the spiral the same way twice. Some drew it wide and gentle, others tight and narrow. But all began their line in exactly the same place, the bottom left, coiling sunwise toward the center. To the modern mind, these are just fragments of folklore, superstition clinging to a rural community. But in Glenori, folktales are not only memory, they are warnings. And the more you hear them, the more you begin to wonder if they are not about the past at all, but about something that has not yet happened. For decades, Elsie Cameron's disappearance was spoken of only in whispers, as though naming her aloud might summon her fate back into the present. But in the winter of 1924, a schoolteacher named Morag Sutherland came across something strange while helping an elderly woman sort through the contents of a deed chest.
Elderly villager clear out her attic. In a wooden chest, wrapped in yellowed linen, lay a bundle of handwritten music sheets. The ink was browned with age, the paper brittle, but the neat script in the Gaelic tongue was still legible. The title read, Elisaid, the Song of Elsie. The melody was haunting, slow, and written in a minor key, with lyrics describing a young girl walking through the glen at twilight. In the song, she is carrying wool in her arms and pauses by the stones to rest. The final verse speaks of her looking into the moon's black mirror and hearing the call from the coil. After that, silence. No conclusion, no return. Sutherland was chilled. She had taught Elsie's story in the local history lessons, but this song contained details never mentioned in the Kirk's registry. Most disturbingly, it referenced the rowan berries. In the lullaby, the girl places them in a circle at her feet, so the path may know her name. When Sutherland asked the villager where the song came from, the old woman laughed softly and said it had been sung in her family for as long as anyone could remember. Her grandmother had sung it, and her grandmother before her. None of them had questioned its origin. It was simply a keeping song, meant to hush children in the long Highland nights. But the name Elsie was too specific to ignore. If the song truly predated the 1746 disappearance, then either it was an eerie coincidence, or the song had been waiting for the event, as though foretelling it. Sutherland began searching for other versions in nearby villages. In a small hamlet 3 miles from Glenori, she found another, but here the name had been replaced with Moira. In yet another, the girl was Annie.
The verses were identical, except for the name and the final refrain. "Do not follow the coil, child. The coil will follow you." This refrain was absent in the Song of Elsie. By spring, Sutherland had compiled 5 variations, each tied to a real disappearance in the last 200 years. The melodies matched, the imagery matched. Only the names changed, like placeholders filled in when the spiral took someone new. What made her abandon the research is still unclear. Some say she began to hum the tune absent-mindedly in class. Others claim she was seen one evening walking toward the stones, her hands clasped around something small and red. She never spoke of the lullaby again. By all accounts, Morag Sutherland was a sensible woman. She had taught at the Glenori Parish School for nearly 15 years, kept careful attendance books, and was known for her brisk, no-nonsense manner. Villagers trusted her judgment. If Morag said the river was unsafe to cross, no one argued. But after the winter she found the Song of Elsie, those who knew her began to notice small, almost unremarkable changes. She lingered longer in the classroom after lessons ended, her eyes fixed on the music sheet spread across her desk. She began walking home at dusk instead of daylight, claiming the extra hours were from marking papers. One evening in early March, a shopkeeper saw her stop beside the baker's stall, staring at a rowanberry wreath hung for decoration. She didn't buy it, simply touched the berries lightly one by one before moving on. The shopkeeper thought little of it until weeks later when the same wreath was found missing. Her landlady, Mrs. Kerr, reported that Morag had taken to humming softly in the evenings. At first it was tuneless, like a habit picked up absent-mindedly, but gradually the hum settled into a distinct melody, slow, minor, almost mournful. When asked, Morag would stop abruptly and change the subject. In April, during the lambing season, a shepherd spotted her walking the narrow track toward the standing stones. She carried nothing but a small parcel wrapped in cloth. The parcel's shape was irregular, but it could have been food for the journey. When the shepherd waved and called her name, she smiled faintly, nodded, and kept walking without breaking stride. By the time he reached the glen 20 minutes later, she was gone. The stones stood silent under the low clouds, and there was no sign of her along the tracks leading out. The next morning, she arrived at school as though nothing had happened. Her clothes were dry, despite the night's rain, her hands unmarked. But on her desk, beneath the day's lesson notes, lay the sheet music for the Song of Elsie, now with an extra verse written at the bottom in the same neat script. "And if the moon forgets your name, the Coil will write it still." She offered no explanation. From then on, Morag never mentioned the song again. The bundle of music sheets was returned to the villager's attic, the chest locked. But on certain evenings, those passing the schoolhouse swore they could still hear her humming through the window, a sound that faded the moment they stopped to listen. It was the summer of 1931 when Glenori saw its next disappearance. The man's name was Donald McCrae, a quiet, broad-shouldered farmhand who worked the pastures north of the loch. Donald was not the sort to invite gossip. He drank little, kept to his work, and lodged in a small bothy near the McPhersonson farm. The only surviving account of his final hours came from a man named Hugh Calder, who gave his statement to the Argyll constable 2 days later. Calder, a cattle drover, claimed he had been walking the moor track at twilight when he spotted Donald ahead of him. He was carrying something, he said. Looked like a satchel, but I couldn't swear to it. He wasn't heading toward his bothy, he was going to the stones. Calder said he called out to him, not once, but 3 times. Donald didn't answer. He didn't even turn. I caught up a bit. That's when I noticed the humming, low, like a man talking to himself, but without words, just that same note, over and over. When Calder reached the small rise before the glen, Donald had already stepped into the circle of stones.
Calder swore he saw him walk slowly toward the largest stone, the one with the faint spiral carved into its face. The satchel hung loosely from his hand. The next moment, a bank of mist rolled in from the east. Calder said it was sudden, like someone had tipped a pail of smoke into the glen. He hurried down the track, but by the time he reached the stones, Donald was gone. The ground was dry. There were no footprints beyond the ones leading in. The satchel was gone as well. When the constable asked Calder if he might have been mistaken, if Donald had simply walked out the far side, Calder shook his head. "I've driven cattle through that glen in the glen."
All weathers. There's no path beyond the stones, just the peat bog. A man walking in at dusk wouldn't get far, not without leaving a sign. Donald McCrae's lodgings were later searched. His clothes, tools, and wages were untouched. On the small table by his bed sat a single object, a wreath of rowan berries, still bright red, though the summer heat should have wilted them weeks before. No one saw Donald again. The disappearance of Donald McCrae should have triggered a straightforward missing person search, but in Glenori, such cases rarely stayed straightforward for long. Constable Robert Fraser, newly posted to the parish from Glasgow, was determined to follow procedure. On the morning after Hugh Calder's statement, he assembled a search party of 6 men, armed with lanterns, poles, and dogs, trained to track scent across open moorland. Within an hour, the trouble began. The villagers balked at the idea of entering the Standing Stone Circle. Some muttered about wasting daylight on superstition, but their hesitation was too sharp, too practiced to be simple laziness. Even Calder, the sole witness, refused to step past the first ring of turf. Fraser, used to city stubbornness but not rural silence, pressed them. "A man is missing," he reminded them. "Do you want me to report to headquarters that Glenori stands idle while one of its own vanishes?" That was when the elder, Duncan McPherson, spoke up. "You'll find no one past those stones, Constable, and if you go looking, you may come back short-handed yourself." The younger men shifted uncomfortably. Fraser dismissed the warning as foolishness and stepped forward. The dogs refused. They sat on their haunches, whining, eyes fixed on the largest stone. No coaxing or tugging moved them. By noon, the search had turned sour. Fraser ordered the men to fan out and sweep the peat bog to the east. The villagers obeyed slowly, but the unspoken resistance hung in the air. They scanned the ground half-heartedly, avoided certain hollows, and returned before their assigned sectors were complete. That evening, tempers flared in the public house. Fraser accused the villagers of hiding something. The locals accused him of poking where no sense lies. One man claimed Donald's fate had been sealed the moment he took to hummin', and another muttered that the Coil doesn't care for strangers meddling. Fraser recorded all of it in his report, which was later found missing from the parish file. Only the cover page remained, marked in his handwriting, "No recoverable remains. Locals uncooperative. Recommend no further deployment." Weeks later, Fraser himself was transferred back to Glasgow. No official reason was given, but in the village, the mood shifted. Doors closed a little quicker after sunset. Children were told to keep away from the glen, not with sternness, but with quiet urgency. And in the kirk's back pews, it was whispered that another disappearance meant the Coil's cycle had begun again. It was weeks after Donald McCrae's disappearance when the name The Coil first reached Constable Fraser. It came not from the gossip in the public house or whispers on the moor, but from an unlikely source, Reverend Malcolm Kerr, minister of Glenori's small kirk. Fraser had come to Kerr seeking cooperation for a second search party. The Reverend, a thin, scholarly man with pale eyes, declined the request. But before sending the constable away, he closed the kirk door, lowered his voice, and said, "You won't find Donald, and you won't find Morag either, not unless the Coil chooses to return them." Fraser, thinking this was another superstition, pressed for an explanation. Kerr hesitated, then opened an old leather-bound ledger from the kirk's archives. Inside were pages of neat handwritten entries, baptisms, marriages, and deaths, stretching back nearly 2 centuries.
Near the back was a short, heavily inked note from the year 1814. Elizabeth McInnes, daughter of Angus McInnes, gone missing after the midsummer watch. Villagers report hearing the first song near the standing stones, marked as taken by the Coil. Kerr explained that in the Old Gaelic of the region, coible, pronounced like coil, meant a turning or a wheel. The coil's cycle was said to repeat every 17 years, marked by the appearance of a certain song, slow, mournful, and in a tongue most could not place. Those who heard it for more than a few nights began to hum it without realizing. Then they would vanish, always near the stones, always without a trace. According to Kerr, elders in the village used to guard the glen during the cycle years, burning rowan branches and singing counterchants to drown out the melody. But as the decades passed and the younger generations left to the cities, the tradition faded. Fraser asked if anyone had ever returned. Kerr's gaze shifted to the kirk's far window, where the stones stood faint against the distant hills. "One man," he said finally, "in 1863. He came back after 4 days, clothes soaked through, eyes bloodshot. He could not speak a word, not then, not ever again." The constable left the kirk unsettled. He didn't believe in cycles or in songs that stole people. But that night, while walking past the schoolhouse, he heard something faint, almost lost to the wind, a slow, minor hum, just a few notes repeated, the same pattern Hugh Calder had described. When he turned toward the sound, it stopped. Constable Robert Fraser had never been a man for superstition. Yet that night, after leaving the kirk, the faint humming followed him all the way to his lodgings. It was never loud enough to be certain, but always there, weaving through the wind, clinging to the edges of thought. By midnight, he decided he'd had enough. Lantern in one hand, service revolver holstered at his side, he took the narrow sheep track toward the glen. The moon was low, a pale smear behind a sheet of cloud. Every step crunched on frost-bitten grass, though the air was not yet cold enough for frost. The closer he drew to the stones, the clearer the sound became. 3 notes, then a pause, then 3 again. It wasn't whistled. It wasn't sung. It was inside the air, as if the glen itself was breathing it out.
Halfway down the slope, he stopped. Something was moving in the mist ahead. Not a figure exactly, more a shadow shifting against the fog. Fraser called out, his voice steady. "McCrae! Morag!" The shadow stilled, then turned. For a moment, he thought he saw the outline of a broad-shouldered man, but taller. Too tall. The lantern light didn't reach far enough to show a face. Fraser's instincts told him to advance. Instead, he stepped sideways, circling toward the larger of the standing stones. That was when he noticed the spiral carving, glistening as if wet, though no rain had fallen. The grooves shimmered faintly, as though catching light from somewhere unseen. The humming grew louder. His heartbeat tried to match it, thudding an uneven rhythm. He drew the revolver, more out of habit than need, and took another step forward. The shadow retreated into the mist. Fraser followed just 2 paces before his boots sank, not deep, just enough to feel the pull of the bog beneath. He glanced down. The ground around his feet was bone dry. The humming stopped. He turned toward the stones, but they were gone. The glen was empty, a flat sweep of mist and grass. The path he had come down was no longer there. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, somewhere behind him, the 3 notes began again. Slow, patient, unbroken. Fraser ran. By the time he stumbled back into the village, lantern glass cracked, his boots coated in black peat up to the ankles. He said nothing to anyone, not that night, not for many years after. Years passed in Glenori, but Constable Robert Fraser carried a burden heavier than any badge. The night he ventured into the mist-shrouded glen haunted his every waking moment.
Yet not a soul in the village ever heard the full truth. Fear and tradition wove a thick silence around the Coil's legacy, and Fraser knew the price of breaking it could be ruin. The story might have died with him had it not been for the sudden arrival of a young historian from Edinburgh, Anne McCallum. She was relentless, with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, drawn by whispers of the missing ones and strange disappearances along the old standing stones. Fraser, now retired and graying, found himself faced with a choice. He could remain silent, as always, or trust someone from outside the tight-knit community, someone who didn't fear the shadows. One damp autumn afternoon, Anne sat with Fraser in his modest sitting room, walls lined with decades of dusty books and fading photographs. Outside, the wind rattled the panes, carrying faint echoes of distant hills. "I've read the Kirk's records," Anne said, quietly, flipping through a worn ledger. "But there are things they never wrote down. You've seen the Coil, haven't you? You know what happens when that song returns." Fraser stared at the fire, his fingers tracing the rim of a chipped cup. His voice was low, heavy with years of restraint. "It's not just superstition. The Coil, it's a cycle of loss, a darkness that chooses its own. I saw it that night. I heard the song, felt it in my bones. There was a shadow in the mist, not a man, but something else, something ancient." Anne leaned in, her eyes wide but steady. "Did you ever see Donald or Morag again?" "No," Fraser said, shaking his head. "They were gone before dawn. And the stones vanished too, like the earth swallowed them whole." For the first time, Fraser spoke of the hollow ache in his chest, the weight of lives lost, the unspoken fear that some cycles could never be broken. Anne placed a hand on his, a quiet offer of understanding. "This story has to be told, not just as folklore, but as a warning. The past is buried here, but it's not dead." Fraser nodded slowly, the decades of silence finally beginning to crack. Outside, the wind carried a faint hum. The Coil song carried through the hills, waiting for its next turn. Anne McCallum's arrival in Glenori stirred more than just old dust and forgotten memories. Her questions, polite but persistent, unsettled the village's delicate silence. The older generation, those who still remembered whispered warnings, regarded her with weary eyes. But a few, bound by a sense of duty or guilt, began to share fragments of a story carefully buried beneath layers of time and fear. On a crisp morning, Anne found herself sitting in the modest living room of Morag Sinclair, one of the last elders who dared speak openly. Morag was a small woman, her face mapped by decades of wind and hardship. Her voice was rough, as if it carried the weight of every sorrow she had ever witnessed. "They call it the Coil," Morag began, her gaze distant. "Not just a song or a shadow, but a turning of fate. Every 17 years, the Coil rises like the tide, and the glen takes what it wants." Anne listened intently as Morag recounted tales passed down through generations. Stories of young men and women disappearing without a trace, lives claimed by a darkness that no one could explain. The standing stones, she explained, were not merely ancient relics, but markers, boundary points between the world of the living and the realm the Coil called home. Morag's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she spoke of Elizabeth McInnes, the girl lost in 1814, whose name was etched deep into the village's collective memory. Each disappearance, she said, left a scar, not just on families, but on the land itself, which seemed to weep in silent mourning. "The Coil is patient," Morag whispered. "It waits in the wind and the stones, in the silence between heartbeats. And it is hungry." Anne's mind raced, piecing together the fragments with the official record she had uncovered. There was a pattern, a rhythm to the disappearances that no rational explanation could account for. As she thanked Morag and stepped out into the fading light, Anne felt the weight of the past settle over her shoulders. The village was holding its breath, caught between fear and hope, between remembering and forgetting. The Coil song was not just a legend, it was a living nightmare cycling through the hills, unseen but never gone. Determined to uncover the truth buried beneath layers of superstition and silence, Anne McCallum sought out the oldest record she could find. The village archive was a cramped, dim room tucked beneath the kirk, filled with brittle ledgers, faded letters, and forgotten journals that smelled of damp paper and time. Among these relics, Anne discovered the journals of Reverend Duncan MacLennan, a 19th-century minister whose handwriting wavered between faith and doubt.
Desperation. His entries painted a picture far darker than any church record suggested. A community gripped by fear, and a secret tied to the standing stones in the glen. One passage caught her breath. July 1843. The glen calls again. The Coil's song returns with the wind, and once more a child is taken. We are helpless against what stirs beneath the stones, a darkness older than memory. I pray for the souls lost and the families left to mourn, but my prayers feel hollow. The journals hinted at a tragedy long before the missing children of Fraser's time, a curse that began centuries ago in the shadow of the Scottish Highlands. The stones, carved with spirals and ancient runes, were not merely markers, but prison seals, intended to hold back something terrible. Anne's fingers trembled as she turned the fragile pages, each entry revealing accounts of strange sounds, inexplicable disappearances, and villagers driven to madness by the Coil's haunting melody. The Reverend wrote of desperate rituals, midnight vigils, and prayers offered in secret, hoping to keep the darkness at bay. This was no ordinary folklore. It was a documented history of fear woven tightly with faith and despair. As Anne pieced these fragments together, she felt the weight of centuries pressing down. The Coil was not just a local myth, it was a relentless force bound to the land and its people, demanding a terrible price. Outside, a wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest trace of that mournful, haunting song, the Coil whispering through the glen once more. Among the fragile pages Anne uncovered in the dim archives was a small leather-bound diary, worn with age and the touch of trembling hands. It belonged to Elizabeth McInnes, a young woman from Glenori whose story was whispered with sorrow but never fully told. Elizabeth's handwriting was delicate yet purposeful, revealing a sharp mind trapped in a time when superstition ruled. Her entries described a childhood filled with joy and the natural beauty of the Scottish Highlands, but also a growing unease, strange sounds at night, a coldness that settled in the glen like a shroud. In one chilling passage, Elizabeth wrote, "The stones sing to me when the moon is full, a low humming melody that fills the night air and pulls at something deep within my soul. Father says it is the wind, but I know it is more. I fear the Coil is near." The Coil, she explained, was an ancient presence, a dark force tied to the standing stones, demanding a sacrifice every 17 years. Elizabeth's words captured the quiet terror that gripped the village as the next cycle approached. Her last entries grew increasingly desperate. She spoke of dreams where shadowy figures danced in the mist, and of neighbors who vanished without a trace. She confided in her diary that she feared she might be next.
On a cold night in November 1814, Elizabeth disappeared. Search parties scoured the glen, but no sign of her was ever found. The stones near the village glowed faintly with an eerie light the following morning, a silent testament to the darkness that had claimed her. Anne held the diary close, feeling the weight of Elizabeth's fear and the silence that had followed her disappearance. This was the beginning. The Coil's terrible legacy was not born of recent times, but stretched back through centuries, each loss a note in its haunting song. The villagers who survived the early 19th century carried the story in hushed tones, wary of speaking openly, lest the Coil be drawn again. The memory of Elizabeth was a shadow that haunted Glenori, a reminder that some histories are buried deep for a reason. Anne knew that to understand the present, she had to piece together these shattered echoes of the past. Elizabeth's story was the key, the first chapter in a cycle of darkness and loss that no one had dared to fully confront. Outside, the wind whispered again, the faint Coil song threading through the hills like a ghostly refrain, a call that no one in Glenori could ignore. Anne McCallum's investigation led her beyond the dusty archives and into the homes of Glenori's remaining families, descendants of those who had lived through the Coil's darkest chapters. These families bore the invisible weight of history, their lives marked by stories whispered over firesides and fears passed down like heirlooms. One afternoon, Anne visited the home of the McGregor family, whose roots in the glen stretched back centuries. Sitting across from her was Ian McGregor, a stoic man in his 70s, with eyes that reflected a lifetime of hardship and secrets. His weathered hands rested on a wooden table, scarred with age and use. Ian said, "We carry the Coil with us, not just in our stories, but in our blood. There's a sadness here that won't leave, a shadow cast long before we were born." Ian recounted how his great-great-grandmother had lost 3 children to mysterious illnesses, and how the family had been haunted by disappearances that seemed to follow no pattern. Sudden, unexplained vanishings that left empty chairs and broken hearts. Anne listened as he described the strange coincidences, odd sounds echoing near the stones, sudden chills even in the summer months, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. The McGregors had learned to live with the Coil's presence, their lives a delicate balance between acceptance and defiance. But it wasn't just the McGregors. In homes scattered across the glen, Anne found variations of the same tale. Families fractured by loss, bound together by a shared understanding of the unseen force that shaped their destinies. The Coil was more than legend. It was a living thread woven into the very fabric of Glenori, connecting past to present in a web of fear and resilience. Anne's conversations revealed something more profound, an unspoken pact among the villagers to protect each other, to keep the Coil's true nature hidden from the outside world. The pain was theirs alone to bear. Yet beneath this communal silence, Anne sensed a growing unrest. The younger generation, no longer content with silence, sought answers. They questioned the old ways and wondered if the cycle could be broken. As Anne prepared to leave the McGregor home, the wind stirred outside, carrying with it that familiar, haunting melody, the Coil song, a reminder that some legacies are not easily escaped. Anne's research and interviews stirred renewed interest in the Coil's dark past, and she found herself facing an unexpected and unsettling opposition. The Glenori Village Council, a group of long-standing elders and influential families, summoned her to a meeting in the small,
austere town hall, The room was heavy with unspoken tension, its wooden beams and peeling paint seeming to close in around her. Sitting behind a worn oak table were the council members, their faces carved by years of guarding secrets and surviving harsh Highland winters. Their expressions were stern, eyes shadowed with warning. Councillor MacLeod, the eldest among them, spoke first. His voice was low but firm. "Miss McCallan, you've stirred a hornet's nest. The Coil is not a story for outsiders, or even for us to pry into too deeply. Some things are best left buried for the safety of the glen and the peace of its people." Anne tried to explain her intentions, that she sought only to understand and share the truth, to honor those lost, and perhaps bring closure. But the council was unyielding. Another member, Miss Sinclair, her gaze sharp and unblinking, warned, "There are forces tied to the stones older than our village. Curious minds bring danger, not answers. The disappearances, the sickness, they are not accidents. They are the Coil's price. Challenge it, and you risk more than you know." Anne felt a cold unease settle in her chest. Their words were not just warnings, but veiled threats. The council's resistance was rooted not only in fear, but in an ancient code, a protective silence passed down through generations. They believed that disrupting the fragile balance with outside attention could awaken forces long dormant. Despite their warnings, Anne's resolve hardened. The more they pushed her away, the more determined she became to uncover the full story. What were they protecting, and at what cost? As she left the hall, the wind howled outside, a mournful echo that seemed to carry the council's fears on its breath. The Coil song, distant yet persistent, reminded her that some secrets were guarded by more than just memory. They were protected by fear, tradition, and the unknown. Anne realized that in Glenori, the past was not just history, it was a living force, one that demanded respect and caution, but also, perhaps, a reckoning. Determined to push beyond the council's veiled warnings, she turned her focus to the ancient standing stones themselves, the silent sentinels perched on the ridge overlooking Glenori. Local lore held that these monoliths were far older than the village, remnants of forgotten times and older powers. They were said to be the heart of the Coil's dark influence. Anne's investigation uncovered a faded manuscript in the archives, detailing an ancient ritual once performed beneath the full moon. The ceremony, known simply as the Ritual of the Coil, was believed to bind the village's fate to the stones, a pact sealed in blood and sacrifice. According to the manuscript, every 17 years, the village was compelled to offer a sacrifice to the Coil, a child born from within the bloodline marked by fate, to ensure the community's protection and survival. The ritual was said to renew the power that kept the land fertile, the winters bearable, and the spirits at bay. Anne felt the weight of the words pressing down on her, a chilling blend of pagan rites and the desperate measures of an isolated community struggling against nature's harshness. The ritual wasn't merely superstition, it was a brutal reality that shaped the lives of generations. She traced the lineage of those lost to the Coil, their disappearances timed precisely with the cycles of the ritual. The standing stones, she theorized, were not mere monuments, but conduits, vessels through which the ancient force demanded its due. Anne's growing knowledge made the shadows around her deepen. Villagers who once spoke with caution now looked away, unwilling to confront the legacy that had defined their very existence. One evening, guided by moonlight and the whispers of the manuscript, Anne ventured alone to the stones. The air was thick with mist, the ground uneven and soaked with the scent of earth and decay. As she stepped between the monoliths, a cold breeze stirred, carrying with it that haunting Coil song, a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to pulse through the stones themselves. She imagined the ancient villagers gathered here centuries ago, bound by fear and devotion, performing the grim ceremony to ensure survival at an unfathomable cost. Anne's heart pounded with a mix of dread and resolve. To unravel the Coil's mystery was to confront not only the past, but the living power that still pulsed beneath the glen's serene surface. The ritual was no longer just history. It was a warning, a dark chord echoing through time, demanding attention before it claimed another soul. Anne's search for answers led her to the outskirts of Glenori, where the ruins of an old family cottage stood half swallowed by moss and wild bracken. Locals whispered that this had been the home of the McGregor family during the last ritual cycle, a place marked by tragedy and silence. Inside the crumbling walls, Anne found remnants of a life abruptly abandoned, a cracked tea set, faded photographs, and a scarred journal. The journal belonged to Eileen McGregor, the last known child believed to have been marked for the Coil sacrifice. Her writing was fragmented, the pages stained with time and tears. Anne read the desperate entries, Eileen's growing fear, her isolation, and the inexplicable events leading to her disappearance. In one entry, Eileen described hearing the Coil song echo through the hills, a lullaby twisted into a dirge, calling her towards the stones. She spoke of strange figures cloaked in shadows, their voices chanting in a language older than the glen itself. The final page ended abruptly, leaving a chilling void where hope should have been. Anne realized that the ritual's toll was more recent, a wound barely healed and carefully concealed. The village had tried to bury not only the story, but the pain itself. With each discovery, the Coil's hold over Glenori became clearer. It was not just a relic of ancient superstition, but a living curse, exacting a price in silence and sorrow. Determined to break the cycle, Anne vowed to bring these hidden truths into the light. But she knew that confronting the Coil's last offering meant facing the village's darkest fears and perhaps awakening the power that had lain dormant for too long. Anne's relentless quest to unearth the truth about the Coil's dark legacy soon drew unwanted attention. The village, cloaked in its misty isolation, had its guardians, those bound by blood, tradition, and fear to protect the secret at any cost. One crisp morning, as Anne prepared to visit
the local archives, she was intercepted by two stern-faced men. Their weathered jackets and steady gazes marked them as lifelong residents, but their intentions were far from welcoming. Miss McCallum, the taller one, began, his voice low but firm. "You don't understand what you're meddling with. The Coil isn't a story to tell, it's a curse, and those who dig too deep end up lost to it." Anne met their gaze steadily. "I'm not here to stir trouble. I want to understand what happened, to honor those who suffered. They deserve that much." The men exchanged a glance, their faces hardening. "Some things are better left in silence," the second man warned. "You've been warned once. This is your last." Undeterred, but aware of the stakes, Anne pressed on. She knew the villagers' resistance stemmed not only from superstition, but from a desperate desire to protect what little remained of their community and identity. That evening, Anne attended a gathering in the village's modest chapel, an event she had learned was attended by the council and key families. Under flickering candlelight, she observed whispered conversations laden with tension and fear. Afterward, a quiet voice reached her, an elderly woman named Moira, whose eyes held both sorrow and courage. Moira confided in Anne that while many guarded the secret out of fear, a few longed for the truth to be known, hoping it might end the cycle of suffering. Moira revealed fragments of forbidden knowledge, how the ritual's roots intertwined with ancient pagan rites brought by settlers from Scotland, twisted over centuries into a cruel tradition. She spoke of the cost, not only in lost lives, but in shattered souls. Anne felt the heavy weight of responsibility. The Coil was no longer just a mystery, but a living tragedy that had claimed generations. Its guardians, both protectors and prisoners of the past, faced an uncertain future. With Moira's cautious support, Anne gained access to private family records and testimonies, a trove of forgotten voices yearning to be heard. But the villagers' warnings echoed in her mind. The Coil's power thrived on silence, and breaking that silence could unleash consequences far beyond her control. As she pieced together the final fragments of the story, Anne understood one thing with chilling clarity. Some secrets were fiercely protected for a reason, and confronting them demanded bravery beyond ordinary measure. With Moira's fragile trust, Anne delved deeper into the village's oldest secrets, unearthing a history steeped in blood, fear, and desperate survival. The curse of the Coil, she discovered, was not simply a local superstition, but a dark legacy brought over centuries ago, a grim inheritance from Scotland's remote Highlands. Moira revealed that the earliest settlers of Glenori were descendants of clans fleeing brutal clan wars and religious persecution. Among them was the Sinclair family, renowned for their fierce loyalty, but also whispered to have dabbled in forbidden rituals to protect their lineage. Centuries before, in a cold stone fortress nestled deep in the Scottish Highlands, the Sinclairs had made a pact with an ancient force, one that demanded unwavering loyalty and sacrifice. The ritual involved a coil-shaped talisman said to bind the family's fate to the land, granting prosperity, but at a devastating price. When the Sinclairs crossed the Atlantic fleeing the bloody conflicts of Scotland, they carried that pact with them, an unspoken vow encoded in their bloodline. As the family spread and the generations passed, the ritual's original meaning twisted and darkened, becoming a code of genetic purity and sacrifice within Glenori. Anne pored over brittle manuscripts, letters, and fragmented oral histories. She saw the reoccurring patterns: marriages between close kin, sudden disappearances, and the ominous Coil song echoing through the glen whenever a sacrifice was due. The curse, Moira explained, was a binding contract that could not be broken without dire consequences. Attempts to defy it had resulted in illness, madness, or untimely death, tragedies dismissed by villagers as bad luck or divine punishment. Anne felt the crushing weight of generations, how the need for survival had chained an entire community to a cycle of suffering and silence. The Coil was more than a symbol. It was a living force, feeding on fear, obedience, and blood. It held the village in its grip, ensuring that the pact made long ago remained unbroken. Yet Anne could not accept that the past should dictate the future. She resolved to confront the curse not with superstition, but with knowledge and courage. But as she prepared to expose the Coil's origin to the world, she sensed that the forces guarding the secret were watching, shadows poised to strike. The ancient pact still hung heavy over Glenori, its coil tightening with every revelation. The deeper Anne ventured into the Coil's ancient curse, the more the village seemed to close in around her like a tightening noose. The fragile trust Moira had placed in her came with a warning. Some truths demanded a heavy price. Anne's intention was simple: to bring light to a shadowed history and end a cycle of silence and suffering. But as she prepared to share her findings, subtle threats began to shadow her steps. A broken window here, a threatening note left on her doorstep there, clear messages that summoned Glenori wanted the past to remain buried. One evening, as Anne returned from the local library, a cold wind swept through the narrow streets, carrying with it the faint, mournful melody of the Coil song, a haunting tune said to summon the cursed spirits bound to the land. It wrapped around her like a shroud, a reminder that the past was never truly gone. Determined not to be cowed, Anne arranged a private meeting with the village council, the self-appointed guardians of the Coil's secret. The room was heavy with tension as she laid bare the history she had uncovered. The Sinclair Pact, the generational sacrifices,
the deliberate silencing of victims. Faces hardened. Some whispered about curses and fate. Others, with tears hidden behind stern eyes, acknowledged the unbearable weight their ancestors had borne. Anne realized that the villagers were themselves prisoners, trapped between honoring tradition and confronting horror. But not everyone feared the truth. A few quietly expressed relief, as if Anne's revelations gave voice to the suffering they'd long been forced to conceal. That night, Anne returned to the ruins of the McGregor cottage and found Moira waiting. The elder woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears. The Coil's power feeds on fear, but it is also broken by courage, Solal. What you do next could free us, or doom you, Saul. Anne knew that exposing the Coil's origin would not simply be a journalistic scoop. Some ancient emos,
Coil's curse would not only challenge superstition, but also the fragile fabric holding the village together. Some might embrace change, others resist fiercely, and some might disappear into the night, swallowed by shadows. She also understood the personal toll. To confront such darkness was to invite loss, isolation, and danger. But Anne had come too far to turn back now. Her investigation sparked whispers beyond Glenori's borders. Academics, journalists, and descendants of other Highland clans began to take notice. The story of the Coil was no longer confined to a forgotten glen. It was becoming a symbol of the hidden costs of ancestral secrets and unyielding tradition. As Anne prepared to publish her findings, she felt the weight of generations upon her shoulders. The voices of the lost children, the silent victims, and the brave few who dared to remember. The Coil's song was fading, but its echo remained, a haunting reminder that history, no matter how deeply buried, demands to be heard. Anne's research was reaching a climax. Among the dusty manuscripts and faded letters, she uncovered references to a ritual that went far beyond genetic sacrifice. The Coil was not just a symbol. It was believed to hold a power that tethered the villagers' souls to the land itself. In an ancient Gaelic text, Anne found chilling descriptions of the binding of the Coil. The ritual involved not only blood sacrifice, but a dark invocation meant to root the family's spirit into the soil, ensuring prosperity for some, but eternal torment for others. The ritual's true horror was the curse it placed on the descendants. They were bound in life and death, trapped within Glenori's mist-shrouded hills, unable to escape their fate no matter how far they fled. Anne's discoveries explained the decades of disappearances and the strange illnesses that plagued the village. It wasn't just genetics or superstition. It was a supernatural force born of ancient rites and unbroken blood vows. Determined to witness the remnants of this ritual, Anne ventured into the forbidden forest near the village's edge. Under a pale moon, she found a circle of weathered stones arranged in the shape of a coil. Symbols carved into the rocks pulsed faintly in the moonlight, marks that spoke of binding, sacrifice, and eternal watchfulness. Suddenly, a whisper of wind carried a voice, ancient, mournful, and warning, that seemed to seep from the earth itself. Anne felt the weight of countless souls bound by the Coil, their suffering eternal. Returning to the village, Anne confronted the council with her findings. Some denied it outright, clutching to denial like a lifeline. Others, broken by the truth, admitted the Coil's supernatural hold and pleaded for release. Anne knew that breaking the curse would require more than knowledge. It would demand ritual, courage, and the willingness to face the darkness without flinching. She began organizing a gathering with those willing to confront the past, a final act to sever the Coil's grip and free Glenori from its ancient prison. But the Coil's power was not merely a superstition. It was a living force, fueled by centuries of fear, pain, and obedience.
As Anne understood, the battle was just beginning, and the stakes were nothing less than the souls of an entire people. The air in Glenori had changed. What had once been a quiet village, resigned to its fate, now hummed with a fragile hope and an undercurrent of dread. Anne's revelations about the binding of the Coil had shattered decades of silence, forcing the villagers to confront a dark legacy that had shaped every breath they took. Gathering in the heart of the village was no easy task. Fear had long kept families fractured and secrets tightly sealed. But the weight of generations crushed more than courage. It broke the chains of denial. Led by Anne and Moira, a small but determined group came together to attempt the impossible: sever the supernatural bond that had tethered them to the cursed land for centuries. The night of the ritual was cold, heavy with mist curling over the hills like creeping shadows. Under the faint glow of a waning moon, the villagers assembled near the ancient stone Coil, the very heart of the curse. The circle, worn by time and weather, seemed to pulse faintly, as if aware of the moment to come. Anne held the fragile Gaelic manuscript, its brittle pages filled with the arcane instructions passed down from the earliest Sinclairs. The ritual required the combined strength of the descendants, each offering a token of their bloodline, a symbol of the suffering and resilience entwined in their veins. Moira, as the oldest living bearer of the Coil's history, began the incantation. Her voice, low and trembling, carried the weight of sorrow and defiance. Around the stone spiral, the villagers joined hands, forming a human chain that bridged past and present, life and death. But the Coil's power was no mere superstition. It was a living force fueled by centuries of fear, pain, and obedience. As the ritual progressed, the wind howled through the forest, carrying anguished whispers and chilling cries that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath them. Suddenly, the ground trembled. The stones glowed with an eerie light, and shadows writhed between the trees. Some villagers faltered, their faces pale with terror. Anne gripped Moira's hand tighter, grounding herself in the moment. The curse fought back, a dark tempest, summoned to punish those who dared to defy it. Spectral figures appeared around the perimeter, gaunt and silent, their hollow eyes reflecting endless suffering. These were the lost souls of the McCallums and Sinclair ancestors, bound eternally by the Coil's unyielding grip. Yet the villagers' resolve did not break. Fueled by a desperate need for freedom, they continued the incantation, their voices growing stronger, their hearts united in hope. As the final words left Moira's lips, a sudden silence fell, thick and absolute. The stone's glow faded, the wind stilled, and the ghosts vanished as if released from centuries of torment. In that breathless moment, Anne felt a shift, an unshackling of something ancient and cruel. The Coil's hold had loosened. The morning sun broke over Glenori with a clarity that felt almost miraculous. After centuries shackled by a curse, both bloodborne and supernatural, the village awoke as if from a long, oppressive dream. The Coil's ancient grip, a weight passed down through generations, had finally loosened. Yet in that fragile dawn, Anne understood that freedom was not a single moment, but a long, winding journey.
The villagers gathered in the heart of Glenori's modest square, faces etched with relief, sorrow, and a tentative hope. They had confronted horrors that would have crushed lesser souls. The deliberate destruction wrought by ancestral choices, the genetic and spiritual torment, and the bitter silence that had preserved those dark truths for far too long. Anne stood among them, not as an outsider, but as a witness and a catalyst. The knowledge she had brought to light was both a wound and a balm. It exposed the fractures within the community, but also offered a path toward healing. The binding of the Coil, the twisted ritual designed to anchor their fate to the land, was broken.
But the emotional and cultural scars would not fade overnight. Moira, the village's eldest, spoke softly to the gathered crowd. "We carry the memories of those who suffered in silence. Their pain is ours to bear now, but so is the chance to change. The Coil was a prison, but today it becomes a warning." Families who had once avoided one another out of fear or shame now embraced their shared history, a bridge rather than a barrier. Children played beneath the shadow of ancient stones that no longer seemed to pulse with dark intent. The land itself felt lighter, freer, as if finally exhaling centuries of sorrow. Anne took time to record the stories of Glenori's people, testimonies of loss, resilience, and hope. These were not just echoes of the past, but living voices that demanded to be heard, preserved beyond whispers and shadowed glens. Outside the village, scholars and genetic counselors began studying Glenori's history as a profound lesson in the dangers of isolation and blind adherence to ideology. The Coil's legacy became a symbol, a reminder that progress often requires courage to confront uncomfortable truths, and that the cost of silence can be devastating. Yet Anne also recognized the complexity of human nature. Traditions die hard, and old fears linger. She knew that some would cling to the past, others would try to forget, but the greatest victory was that Glenori had chosen to face its darkness, to break the cycle of suffering rather than surrender to it. In the years that followed, the village slowly transformed. Outreach programs brought education and medical support. Young people left and returned, carrying new ideas and a desire to honor their roots without being bound by them. The Coil story became a tale told not with shame, but with honesty, a dark chapter in history that had shaped them, but no longer defined them. Anne left Glenori with a heavy heart and a hopeful spirit. She understood that her work was part of a larger struggle, the ongoing battle to unearth buried histories and give voice to those silenced by fear, cruelty, or neglect. The Coil, once a symbol of suffering and control, had become a testament to endurance and the power of truth. For Glenori and the many other places hidden beneath layers of forgotten pain, the future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. The file is closed, but tell me, would you dare to uncover the rest?